When the first trains of German prisoners of war rolled into the American heartland in 1943, few could have imagined what awaited them. They came from the crumbling edges of Hitler's Europe, men who had marched under the black sun of the Reich, fought across North Africa, and bled in the hedgerows of France. Their uniforms were worn, their faces hollowed by years of war. But what they found, once the doors of those boxcars opened, was something entirely unexpected. Not the fury of their conquerors, but the quiet rhythm of another world. The U.S. had built over 500 POW camps across its vast countryside, scattered from the pine forests of Alabama to the wheat plains of Kansas, from the icy edges of Minnesota to the dry winds of Arizona. By the end of the war, more than 400,000 Germans would live behind American barbed wire. The first step they took onto American soil was not onto a battlefield, but onto fields of corn, near towns whose names they'd never heard. And for many, that was the beginning of a slow unraveling, of loyalty, of illusion, of everything they thought they knew about the enemy. They had been told that America was a land of chaos and decay, a nation run by Jews and capitalists, racially degenerate, militarily soft. Yet as they were driven through the countryside in guarded convoys, what they saw out the truck windows told a different story. Well-kept farms, paved roads, stores with overflowing shelves, children walking home from schools untouched by war. Even the skies looked clean, free of the smoke that hung like a permanent shadow over Europe. For soldiers who had watched their cities burn, this was disorienting. To see the land of their enemy untouched by bombs felt like stepping into a dream they had been told could not exist. At Camp Swift in Texas, or Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the routine was strict, but strangely humane. They rose early, counted off, marched to breakfast. They were given real coffee, something they hadn't tasted in years, and soft white bread, a rarity even in Germany before the war's end. American guards treated them with discipline but not cruelty. Some guards even spoke German, veterans themselves of earlier wars. It was a captivity that began to feel, to many prisoners, like a kind of mirror. It reflected back everything that the Reich had denied them: abundance, order, decency. And that realization, quiet as it came, was sometimes more shattering than defeat itself. Work became their rhythm. Under the Geneva Convention, they could not be forced into war-related labor, but they were encouraged to work for local farms, factories, and public projects. They harvested crops in the Midwest, repaired roads in the South, and cut lumber in the Northwest. Many American farmers, desperate for labor after so many men had gone to war, came to rely on them, and what began as wary distance often turned into mutual dependence. Farmers would share food, sometimes even invite the Germans to dinner after a long day's work, something forbidden by regulation but quietly accepted. There are letters still preserved in archives and attics, written by prisoners from these camps. One from Camp Shelby, Mississippi reads, "They feed us meat every day. We live better here as prisoners than our families do in Germany." Another from Camp Aliceville, Alabama, describes how townspeople would leave gifts of cigarettes by the fence. It was not sympathy, it was curiosity, a gesture of shared humanity in a war that had stripped so much of it away. For young Americans, these Germans were not monsters. They were boys not much different from their own brothers overseas. The irony of it was heavy. Back in Europe, American soldiers were fighting through hedgerows, wading through rivers of mud and blood. Yet here, in the calm of the American countryside, their captured enemies were living with full stomachs, safe from bombs, and sleeping in clean bunks. The contrast was not lost on the men themselves. Some guards resented it quietly. Others accepted it as the price of honor. Treating prisoners humanely was what separated them from the regime that had plunged the world into chaos. For the prisoners, the psychological effect of this life was complex. At first, many refused to believe the war was truly lost. Radio broadcasts and camp newspapers, often run by German officers, fed them propaganda that victory was still within reach. But, as 1944 bled into 1945, and the camp loudspeakers crackled with BBC reports of the Allied advance, denial began to crumble. News of cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden reduced to ruins reached them like echoes from another planet. Some wept openly when they learned their hometowns no longer existed. Inside the wire, divisions grew. The so-called hardliners, fanatical Nazis who still believed in the Führer's destiny, sought to maintain control. They organized secret cells, enforced discipline, and punished anyone who expressed defeatist thoughts. In some camps, these loyalists even murdered fellow prisoners they accused of treason. The American command, realizing this threat, began separating them into special camps. The others, those who had begun to see the truth, were moved to quieter facilities, where re-education efforts began. It was called the Intellectual Diversion Program, run under the Office of War Information. The goal was not to indoctrinate, but to illuminate, to introduce prisoners to democratic ideals through films, books, and discussions. They were shown documentaries about the American system, about freedom of speech and the press. Some saw photographs of concentration camps after liberation and could not look away. For them, the realization came slowly, painfully, that they had fought for something that had devoured their own nation. By 1945, the camps had become small worlds of their own. Football leagues formed. Orchestras played in converted barracks. Painters filled sketchbooks with landscapes of distant fields. There were moments when the war felt far away, when a man could sit in the shade, listening to cicadas, and almost forget the uniform folded under his cot. But the reminders were always near. Every letter home was censored. Every fence line hummed faintly with tension. And every night, searchlights swept across the wire, their pale arcs slicing the darkness. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, there was no cheer in the camps, only silence. Many prisoners gathered in small groups, staring through the wire at nothing in particular. Some saluted the lowering of their flag. Others turned away. For those who had survived the war untouched by violence, but not by memory, the question now was what waited for them in the ruins of their homeland. The answer would not come quickly. The U.S. did not send them home right away. Europe was shattered, its infrastructure in ruins, its people starving, so the prisoners remained in limbo. Some were transferred to labor battalions in France and Britain, rebuilding what their armies had destroyed. Others stayed in the United States for months, even years. During that time, the distance between guard and prisoner often blurred. Friendships formed, cautious but real. There are stories of American families writing to their former captives long after the war, sending Christmas cards across the Atlantic. For the Germans, America had become an education in contradiction. It was the enemy's land, yet it revealed a kind of decency they had been taught to believe impossible. Many would later say it was there, behind the wire, that they first began to question everything they had believed about their own nation. One former prisoner, Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heide, a Luftwaffe officer, wrote that his time in American captivity convinced him that the moral victory of democracy lay not in force, but in its humanity. The return home was bittersweet. In 1946 and 1947, the ships carried them back across the Atlantic, not as soldiers, but as witnesses. They disembarked into a land unrecognizable. Cities were rubble, families gone. The Reich, once the center of their faith, now a curse. Yet among them were men who carried something unexpected back from their captivity, a new understanding of what civilization could be. Many would go on to rebuild Germany, not in the image of its fallen empire, but in the vision of what they had glimpsed in a faraway land that had once been their enemy. Not all would find peace. For some, captivity had been too comfortable, too shameful to speak of. They returned to communities that viewed them with suspicion. Men who had lived under enemy generosity while their families starved. Others never truly left America behind. Decades later, veterans would return as tourists, standing on the ground where they had once been prisoners. They found that the camps were gone, replaced by parks, fields, or highways. But the memories lingered, in old photographs, in the grain of weathered fences, in the quiet understanding that war's boundaries were never just lines on a map. Perhaps the strangest sight of all was not the prisoners arriving, but the way they left. In some small towns, locals came to see them off, waving as the trucks pulled away. Farmers who had once eyed them warily now shook their hands. Children, grown used to their presence, ran alongside the convoys. For a moment, the war seemed distant, replaced by something far more human, a brief, fragile peace born inside barbed wire. In the years that followed, historians would debate the meaning of that peace. Some saw it as proof of American benevolence, others as an unintended experiment in moral reconstruction. But for the men who lived it, the memory was simpler. It was the realization that the enemy could be merciful, that even in defeat, dignity could survive. And that truth, carried home in silence, would echo long after the war was over. Behind every photograph of those camps lies a paradox. Barbed wire under blue skies, men in uniform working among civilians, guards sharing cigarettes with prisoners. It was a contradiction that defined the end of the Second World War, a reminder that victory was not only about conquest, but about what came after. In those quiet American fields, far from the ruins of Europe, the war's most unexpected transformation took place, enemies becoming men again. And when the last camp gates closed, when the final train departed, the land fell silent once more. The fences came down. The barracks were dismantled. But for those who had lived within them, the memory remained. A strange chapter in history when the men of the Reich saw, for the first time, the country they had been told to hate and found in it the humanity they had almost forgotten. When the ships bearing the last German prisoners left American shores in 1946 and 1947, the decks were crowded with men staring silently at the receding coastline. Some clutched small bundles of personal belongings, letters, sketches, and trinkets given to them by Americans they had worked beside. Others carried nothing at all. The sea wind cut across their faces, cold and sharp, and for many it felt like a final curtain drawing closed on a chapter they still could not understand. They were going home, but few knew what that word meant anymore. The journey back was long and restless. The Atlantic, which had once carried them to war, now returned them as remnants of an army that no longer existed. On the voyage, men traded stories of the camps, comparing rations, guards, and the strange kindness of strangers. Some spoke wistfully of the open fields of Texas or the pine forests of Michigan, of the laughter of American children on the other side of the wire. Others kept to themselves, haunted by guilt, unable to reconcile their safety with the destruction that had consumed their homeland. When they disembarked at ports like Bremerhaven or Le Havre, the air smelled of smoke and rot. The war had ended, but the scars were everywhere. Streets lay in ruin. Families were scattered. Whole towns had vanished under rubble. The returning prisoners were met not with parades or celebration, but suspicion. Many civilians viewed them as collaborators in defeat, or worse, traitors who had lived comfortably while their own families starved under Allied bombs. Few cared that they had been powerless behind American wire. Few understood that captivity had, in many ways, changed them more deeply than the war itself. Reintegration was brutal. The German economy was shattered, industry paralyzed, and food scarce. In the French and British zones, many former POWs were immediately reassigned to labor units, clearing mines or rebuilding bridges. But those who had come from the American camps found themselves carrying something intangible, a faint sense of what reconstruction could look like. They had seen, firsthand, a functioning democracy, a society that operated without fear or propaganda. That experience quietly shaped them. When Konrad Adenauer's new government began rebuilding West Germany, many of the architects of that revival had once been prisoners in the United States. They brought back more than survival. They brought back perspective. Among them was Reinhold Busch, once a medic at Stalingrad, who wrote years later that captivity in America replaced despair with understanding. Another, Helmut Gonschior, remembered working for an American farmer in Kansas, who treated him like a hired hand, not a criminal. "It was then," he said, "that I realized freedom was not something you are given. It is something you live by how you treat others." Such reflections were not isolated. They rippled quietly through the post-war years, shaping the moral foundation of the new Federal Republic. Meanwhile, in America, the camps themselves were dismantled. The barbed wire came down, the guard towers removed, the barracks sold or torn apart for lumber. On the sites where German prisoners had once stood in formation, corn grew again, or cattle grazed. Only faint traces remained, concrete foundations hidden under weeds, or forgotten cemeteries where a few prisoners who never made it home were buried beneath simple white crosses marked Deutscher Kriegsgefangener. Local townspeople tended to those graves for decades, often without ever knowing the men's names. Yet the memory of the POWs lingered in the small towns that had hosted them. In Aliceville, Alabama, the old residents still spoke of the time the Germans came. They remembered how the prisoners had built elaborate Christmas decorations, carved toys for local children, and even staged concerts open to the public. In Nebraska, former guards told their grandchildren about the discipline and politeness of the Germans who worked the fields. And in some cases, friendships formed that would last lifetimes. Letters crossed the Atlantic well into the 1950s, Americans writing to men they once guarded, Germans sending photographs of their rebuilt homes and new families. For both sides, these memories became proof that even in the darkest moments of history, decency could survive. It was a quiet legacy, one never written into treaties or official reports, but carried in the hearts of those who had lived it. There was no ceremony, no declaration, just small human acts of respect that, piece by piece, rebuilt something far more lasting than victory: trust. By the 1960s, many former POWs had rebuilt their lives. Some became teachers, engineers, or farmers. A few even returned to the United States, not as prisoners, but as visitors. They came to stand on the ground where they had once been captives, walking through empty fields where fences had long vanished. Some found their old guards or the families they had worked for. There are photographs from these reunions, gray-haired men shaking hands, smiling awkwardly, tears in their eyes. No speeches, no flags, just silence and memory. What made those moments remarkable was not reconciliation in the grand political sense, but the ordinariness of it. A German man thanking the American farmer who had fed him, a former guard offering coffee to the man he once watched behind barbed wire. These were gestures small enough to go unnoticed by history, yet powerful enough to bridge its deepest wounds. The legacy of those camps rippled outward. The humane treatment of German POWs became a model cited by international observers during later conflicts. It stood as a reminder that victory without cruelty was possible, that strength did not require the surrender of compassion. And perhaps more importantly, it reminded America itself what it was fighting for. But not all stories ended in peace. Some prisoners never recovered from the dissonance of their experience. The world they returned to felt alien, morally and physically destroyed. A few withdrew into silence. Others drowned their guilt in work or drink. They had survived a war, then captivity, but not always themselves. For every man who returned enlightened, another carried the unbearable weight of memory, of what he had seen, what he had done, and what had been done in his name. Yet history tends to remember the light that follows the dark, and in this story, that light burned quietly. In 1983, when the former camp at Aliceville opened a small museum, hundreds of people came, Americans and Germans alike. Old men walked through the exhibits, tracing their fingers along faded photographs. One man, a former POW, stood before a picture of the barracks and said softly, "I thought I would die here. Instead, I learned how to live." That sentiment captures the paradox of their captivity. They had come to America as enemies, products of a totalitarian machine that sought to erase humanity. Yet within the fences of those camps, they encountered a system that, by treating them as men, began to unravel the very ideology they had served. It was not re-education through lectures or propaganda. It was re-education through example. Today, few remember that more German soldiers were imprisoned in America than Americans were captured in the entire European theater. Yet the story of their time here remains one of the most quietly profound episodes of the war, a rare intersection where mercy became a weapon stronger than hate. As the last survivors pass away, their memories fade into the larger silence of the 20th century. But their story endures, in museums, in letters, in the soil of forgotten camps. It endures because it reminds us of something the war nearly destroyed: the idea that even amidst global catastrophe, humanity can still hold its ground. In the end, when the last ship crossed the Atlantic and the last camp faded into the earth, what remained was not victory or defeat, but understanding. The kind of understanding that comes only when men have seen the worst of what they can do to one another, and still find a way to choose decency. For the German prisoners of war who reached America, that decency was the most unusual sight of all.